Well, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to see you all here today. It's a special treat to welcome Rip Rapson back here. As many of you know, Rip has spoken here before, and what he has done in both of his major foundation jobs that I know about, and I'm sure there are a lot that don't know about, has really been to focus on making change in cities. First with the McKnight Foundation in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where he led all sorts of efforts to foster collaboration between the state government, the city governments, and the philanthropic sectors in there, and created quite a reputation for himself in achieving things that made a difference in the state. He may refer to some of those things, and that's his choice if he'd like to. He then moved, I think, in 2006
yes.
to Detroit to be the president and CEO of the Kresge Foundation. In which capacity, I'm sure it may be premature to describe him as a legendary foundation president for what he did, but nonetheless, it seems to me to be legendary in the sense that he really did struggle from the beginning. As those of you who've heard him speak before have seen it step by step on an annual basis. Every 2 years or so, he comes back and tells us what he was doing, what has happened. He illustrates it, as you can see from the slides in front of you, with I don't like to call them cartoons, but
that's generous.
but he does. He comes by that honestly because his father was an architect. Though he says that if his father saw these drawings, he would be very upset.
Oh, he died.
But nonetheless, you know, you've all heard about the grand bargain, which a number of foundations and the city of Detroit and the state of Michigan agreed to, which put, I think, somewhere, about $800 million to enable Detroit not to have to sell the art collection at the Art Institute. Well, that was, in a sense, something that happened along the way, but before the effort to create the grand bargain, the principal donors to which were the Kresge Foundation, which actually gave the largest percentage of its endowment of any of the gifts. So from the Ford put up $125 million, but the Ford's assets were at that point around $13 billion. So you can see the assets of Kresge were about $3.5 billion, and they put up $100 million, basically. And the Knight Foundation was the third largest donor, and they put up, I think, $30 million. But the point of the matter is that everything that the grand bargain was able to do, they were able to do because of all the stuff that you all know. Those of you who've heard this before know that Kresge did in building the base, in creating the partnerships between government and foundations and nonprofits, in getting cooperation from people who typically don't cooperate with one another. And some of when Rip was here before, talked about the difficulties of getting the mayor, for example, of Detroit to sign on to things that needed to be done, or the city manager, or whatever. So it's really, it is an amazing legacy about what can be done under the right leadership. There's somebody who knows how to get things done, and who people respect enough to cooperate with one another in order to get things done. So he's going to talk about now, not about the grand bargain, though he may refer to it a little bit. He's going to talk about what's happened since the grand bargain. Yeah. Grand bargain is now 2 years old, 3 years old?
4.
4 years old. Did we miss a year? No. No. Okay.
No.
I guess 4 years is a good time to assess the consequences and all the things that have happened since then. So in any event, that's what he's going to talk about today, and I hope you find it as interesting as every one of his preceding presentations have been. And so, Rip, the floor is yours.
Oh, well, thank you, Joe. It's always so humbling to be here. I mean, I don't need to tell this group, but there's only one legend at this end of the table, and it's sitting there, not here. But it is a delight to be here. And as Joel suggested, I thought that what I would do would not be to take you through the same material that some of you have heard. I realize not all of you have heard sort of the story of the build, that what Joel described from 2006 when I arrived in Detroit through the Grand Bargain and in the immediate aftermath. I'll refer to that briefly, but what I think might be of greater interest, particularly for those of you who have become familiar with the Detroit story or have seen it, is to talk about what post-bankruptcy has looked like. And I think what I'd like to do is treat that less as an exercise in explaining Detroit than trying to excavate just a bit philanthropic role. It just seems to me that the seminar is really focused on how philanthropy can, should, will engage the really difficult issues of our time, and I think there is actually something to be learned from the sort of the collective work that philanthropy in Detroit has done. And so I'm going to focus a little bit on that. But do I have a clicker, or do I just tell people? Do I move things when they should be moved?
I don't know. Are you doing the moving?
Do you want me to turn this
No,
off?
I mean.
Oh, maybe it's not on the screen. Is it? Are the slides on the screen? I mean, you have them in front of you, and while she's teeing them up, all sorts of disclaimers. I do not draw for a living. These are cartoons. I actually can write incomplete sentences. I mean, there's a bunch of disclaimers that need to go along. But what I found is that as sort of conversation starters, sometimes these can be useful. And it is one of the hazards, I think, of looking at them unexplained, because they're shorthands and they're simply points of departure for larger conversations. Do you want me to click? Great, thank you. I mean, I'm happy to have you click it, but
Thank you, Lonnie.
thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Okay. So if I do that. Okay. So let me just start with a truly impossible drawing, which is the depiction of what Kresge in its current form is, what it does. I'm just going to breeze through a couple of these just to kind of ground us just a little bit. This is simply to say that Kresge is focused, as Joel suggested, on issues of urban opportunity, urban equity, and over the last number of years, we've tried to evolve our foundation in a way that makes sure that each and every one of our bodies of work takes aim at advancing opportunity and equity in cities. It's still a very broad remit, but it's not rural. It's not any number of things. And we felt that it was really important to make sure that the centering point of all of our work was that. As a result, we have both place-based programs, which tend to be in Detroit, Memphis, New Orleans, a handful of places, as well as one or two things I'll talk about. And we have a suite of national programs focused on human services, higher education, health, environment, and arts and culture. We have a very active social investments practice. Those of you who know this field know that this is really a hot topic, and immodestly, I would say, I think actually at Kresge's is the finest social investment practice working in philanthropy right now. Very, very aggressive, very bold, and really fully explores the possibilities of putting non-grant capital into play to advance programmatic initiatives. We don't have a social investments practice just to have glossy, fancy new instruments. They are there to advance what we're otherwise trying to accomplish. In the wake of the 2016 election, I don't mean to be political, but we just felt that there were enough assaults on some of our values that we needed to create a short-term fund to take aim at some of the anti-hatred. It was only about $4 million. It wasn't a big amount, but it was an opportunity for us to try to respond in real time to some of the threats coming out of Charlottesville and other things. And then underneath all of this, the crazy machine, it actually works if you actually track it. You can actually put something in at one end and it comes out the other. Never mind. I have no idea where I came up with this machinery. It's the goofiest thing. It's a sort of a poor man's version of the Diego Rivera in the Art Institute. But the importance here is simply that I've tried to advocate with our board that over the longer term, how we work is almost as important as what you work on. I mean, you never want to substitute method for substance, but on the other hand, the substance changes. Our environment program has changed, our health program has changed with the Affordable Care Act. I mean, all of these bodies of work end up morphing, but if you can work in a way that is consistent and has sort of integrative integrity that actually works to reinforce another, whether it's not being afraid to take some field leadership, working across disciplines, using all of your tools, taking proportionate risk, and partnering with others. And we can come back and talk about all these things. But so that, in a nutshell, is sort of the Kresge we're working with, and it's been both a driver of and a reflection of our work in Detroit, which is why I put it up on the screen, because I think how we have worked in Detroit, I think mirrors what we're trying to do in this drawing, but it also works in the other direction as well. So let me scroll then back into just a little bit of history. David, this is one of the drawings that I told you about. When I arrived in Detroit in 2006, we were in a period of enormous optimism. We had just elected Kwame Kilpatrick, a very hip, smart, Bill Clinton-ish in terms of just sort of photographic memory and facility mayor. And for the first 2 years, it was clear that our role in Detroit was largely to sort of help the mayor be successful. Well, then 2008 came, and we get the Great Recession, you get the housing foreclosure crisis, which hit Detroit with a real vengeance. And then on top of that, you had the auto bankruptcies, which a lot of people tend to forget about, that both Chrysler and GM declared bankruptcy, and Ford was within days of doing the same. And Mayor Kilpatrick was indicted. And it's a whole nother story that is just fascinating, actually, for someone of that kind of talent to fall so far. It was both tragic and monumentally disruptive to our political ecology in Detroit. And so we essentially had the private sector in a bunker, because the whole auto supply chain was just shut down. They couldn't do charitable giving, they couldn't do anything. And so they were kind of in a bunker. The public sector was essentially in the penitentiary, and then the nonprofit sector was just hanging on by a thread. So it really fell to philanthropy as sort of the last standing sector to try to figure out whether it really was prepared to do something. And in previous conversations here, we've talked a lot about the sort of this drawing and how essentially we took these 9 bodies of work and sort of made work plans out of each of them. But what this essentially represented was a response to a sense that there was no coherence in Detroit, there was no sense of strategy in Detroit, and just people were sort of scurrying in all directions. And I think if there was one sort of emblematic moment, it was when in 2009, when I got a call from the Obama administration. A guy named Derek Douglas was in the president's office and basically said, President Obama just released us from a cabinet meeting, and in that cabinet meeting he said, I will not permit Detroit to become the Katrina on my watch. So you've got to be in touch with those folks, figure out what's going on. Well, again, Kilpatrick's in jail, you've got 3 or 4 mayors within a year based on the kind of the goofiness of our governance structure in Detroit. And he said, so we'd love to be helpful, Rip. What should we come and announce? And I thought, that's sort of, I said, what would you like to come and announce? I mean, is there anything you have in mind? You know, money, you know, whatever. He said, well, we really can't make any sense of it. You know, it's just, we don't know what's there, we don't know what's working, we don't know the leadership structure, we don't know if there are investable propositions. So essentially, this drawing came out of that. And essentially what I tried to do was to identify bodies of work that were being led well, by some entity or another, that were in motion, that were actually beginning to show signs of promise, that had real capital arrayed behind it, and which collectively might add up to something. So you'll see in this transit, education, green neighborhoods, central corridor development, small business development, a whole suite of things. And when Joel refers to the building blocks of the sort of the pre-bankruptcy period, this is really what it was, because we took this, turned it sideways, and created work plans for each one of those things and just went about working the plan. And I think I'm actually almost surprised when I go back and look at it. It's because every single one of these played out, every single one. And I think there was a level of intentionality, but you know, there's also lots of other factors, and I don't mean to overstate Philanthropy's role. Lots of people came to the table. Quicken Loans decided to move its headquarters downtown. We now have 14,000 Quicken Loan employees in downtown. So there are lots of other people who, over the course of 2008 to 2013, contributed to this. But I say it just sort of as a way of explaining what we then had in place, to Joel's point, when the bankruptcy hit. Because then in 2013, Governor Snyder, after working pretty hard with the successor administration to Mayor Kilpatrick, Dave Bing, Mayor Bing served for 4 years and became the sort of finally elected person rather than an interim and appointee. After a number of difficult months trying to work out with the city of Detroit how it could avoid bankruptcy, it just became clear that the city's finances were too severely compromised for anything consensual to work out. So Governor Snyder appointed an emergency manager, a guy named Kevin Orr, who had run the Chrysler bankruptcy, a transcendently gifted guy who not only was just a first-rate lawyer and a first-rate sort of bankruptcy workout specialist, but we also had family in Detroit, an African-American guy who had sort of a different sort of sense of what the possibilities of Detroit could be, having sort of seen it through his family's eyes for many years. But essentially, I put this up because the normal story about the bankruptcy was that it was all about the pensions, the long-term health obligations, the long-term debt. And that was a huge nut to crack. It was a $21 billion, $18 to $21 billion problem. And so we had to figure out how to reduce healthcare obligations, how to reorder the pensions. That's where the grand bargain came in, how to satisfy bondholders who held all of this paper against the city and who were dead serious about foreclosing. I mean, there was just no question that these were people who were not going to sort of think kindly about the citizens of Detroit and sort of wait their turn. These are people who, there's something called Socorro. I have no idea. Yep. I won't even go there. I mean, they were tough people. They were the people who were sort of seizing ships in the Atlantic Ocean to get their debts repaid. I mean, they're a tough group.
Vulture.
Oh, they were tough. And so the threat against the art was real. The threat against other city-owned assets was real. And so that whole adjustment was very complicated. But this is what Orr did. And he did it well through the aid of a mediator and getting us all to come to the table. But the second part of the bankruptcy was almost as elusive, and that was we simply couldn't put the books in balance. We just couldn't get the costs and the revenues of the city to balance out for all sorts of reasons you might imagine. And this is what Governor Snyder had worked with Mayor Bing to try to do, and they couldn't do it. They entered into consent orders, but union contracts, lack of tax base, all of this sort of things just sort of conspired. And this is really where Orr went to work. And he basically completely restructured the balance sheet, not just in terms of the long-term balances, but the short-term cost revenue calculation. And we can come back and talk about any of this if you'd like. The real point of this slide, though, is to sort of lead into the purpose of the conversation this afternoon, which is the bankruptcy court, led by a justice named Steve Rhodes, during the bankruptcy proceeding, essentially said, I will trust you to adjust long-term debt in a way that works, one way or another, and I will basically sign off on whatever you can do if it's at all consensual. I actually trust Orr and the new mayor, Mayor Duggan, to get the city's costs and revenues in balance. But what, frankly, I'm not sure I do trust this city to do is to put in place the long-term building blocks of stability and health. Because if we reconcile the debt, and get the balance sheet right, we'll be back here in 2 years, unless you have in place a very clear plan for investing in the city and making sure that the quality of life issues of all types sort of work to stabilize this community and point it in the direction of long-term health. So I was actually asked to testify along with a guy named Roger Penske, one of our leading corporate folks, and Dan Gilbert from Quicken. The judge asked Gilbert whether he was really serious about maintaining his investments downtown. Penske had a 40-year history of investing in the city, including the rail project that he was very helpful in getting off the ground. But they wanted to know from us, the judge wanted to know from me, whether the kinds of building blocks that we had put in place prior to the bankruptcy were simply a stabilizing scaffolding, or whether these were ways in which we perceived over the longer term we could be helpful to the city. And so we actually, during my testimony, drove Sincora nuts, walked through a version of this drawing. I had a much more complicated version, because what I tried to suggest to the
Much more complicated.
Oh, this was really a crazy drawing. They put up the drawing, and Sincora immediately objected. They said, "What is that? It's a drawing." And Judge Rhodes said to our attorney, Orr's attorney, "What is that?" He said, "Well, it's actually a device to walk the witness through what's gone on and what." And he said, "But what is it?" They just could. And so this is actually an exhibit in the Detroit bankruptcy. This drawing, the complicated version of this drawing, because it had all the annotations of all the things we had done. And at any rate, but the point, I'm sorry, the point is that what I suggested to the judge was that rather than the particulars of what we had invested in, community lending, rail, whatever it was, that what I thought from his perspective might be more important was to be assured that we would continue to play a role that helped sort of balance the civic ecology. And so we walked through these 6 roles, and the lawyers sort of both asked me where we had been, and then asked me to sort of project what that might look like post-bankruptcy. And I think the last time I left you all, we had sort of scrolled through lots of examples of what had happened pre-bankruptcy along this frame. And I had suggested where we might go. And what I thought I would do for the time we have is talk a little bit about what we actually have done. And again, back to that initial drawing of the 9 modules, I mean, I think the point is we have tried to project out where we want to end. And there's some fairly big goals, as you'll see, but we're actually beginning to see things line up: capital, infrastructure capacity, problem-solving capacity at the neighborhood level. So what I'd like to do, if it's okay, is do that. And again, we can return to any of these, or you can stop me in any of these and talk more. So the first role is the power of philanthropy to table set. And this sounds so basic. What does that mean? You get people together, you convene. Well, it actually involves trying to identify some of the most intractable issues a community faces and simply is stuck on. So in the case of the pre-bankruptcy era, it was land use. Mayor Bing could not talk about all of the blight and the abandonment without some related conversation about having to relocate people, about having to sort of abandon neighborhoods, favoring some over the others. And so I won't even tell the story. Essentially, he came to us, we developed a process that was both community up and expert down, that sort of met in the middle, that created a land use framework that has essentially endured to this day. But post-bankruptcy, what I suggested to you last time was that I thought a similar table setting function would be to build out an early childhood development system. Our early child development system in Detroit is non-existent. Head Start is sort of chaotic. Informal providers have no support. There's no quality certification. There's no training. It's really difficult. And when you have all of these kids arriving at the schoolhouse door not ready to learn, you can imagine the consequences for the K-12 system, which is its own problem. But we thought if we're going to enter the education space as a philanthropy, maybe this is what we could do. What we I didn't know last time I talked to you was that we actually, oh, this is a tough one, isn't it? If you look at your page, it's not quite so bad. What we have undertaken is to work with the Kellogg Foundation, which is based in Western Michigan, and had really not done a lot of work in Detroit. I mean, they had tried to be helpful around the edges, the Grand Bargain and other things, but they had really not found any signature body of work in Detroit. And we agreed about a year ago, shortly after the last seminar, that it would be really terrific if the two of us could collaborate on a process to ultimately evolve a framework to come at issues of early childhood education in a much more systematic way and begin the process of feathering between early childhood years and the K-12 system. And so we established a stewardship board, not particularly interesting, but it ended up being very political, very hard. Who sits at this board? Is it just foundations? No, clearly not. It's providers, it's the public sector, it's banks who are involved in early childhood. It's really, it's a 25-person board, deeply representative. We then kicked off a very elaborate community process. It lasted almost the better part of a year. Kellogg is very good at this kind of process stuff. They believe deeply in community empowerment and community voice, and they helped us structure something that touched thousands and thousands and thousands of folks in Detroit. Parents, young people, providers, funders, the whole works. Out of that created strategy teams. Out of that sort of became the sort of iterative process where we would come up with ideas, the strategy team would come up with ideas, we'd then go back into the community, they'd react, we'd come back, you know, we back and forth, back and forth. And ultimately we came up with this 6-part strategy, and I won't walk you through it, but suffice it to say, it begins having the sort of the skeletal impact of what a system should look like. It's attending to the physical infrastructure needs of early childhood providers. A lot of these facilities are in desperate need of rehab and code upgrades, building new facilities, doing training for the providers, trying to figure out networks among the family care providers so that they can begin learning from one another, creating quality programs. You guys in North Carolina have actually are way ahead of us, and we talked earlier about the possibility of our going to school, a little bit on what North Carolina has done, but we have already, the little clouds on the right are the investments we've already made. And so we've really tried to put this on full throttle and begin investing in a number of these imperatives, including we've set up a revolving loan fund for facilities upgrades. A number of the providers have already taken advantage of this. And so far, we've had sort of short-term bridge loans, we've had longer-term, more elaborate build-outs. And as I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, we've also determined to create the first very high quality early childhood center in the city of Detroit, as well as tying in Head Start and all the other stuff. So that's the first role. And sorry to go through all of this so quickly, but maybe not quickly enough. The second role was trying to strengthen civic capacity. And again, these things sound like such buzzwords, and at some level they are. But by what I'm trying to suggest here is just strengthening the capacity of the community to solve its problems. And it's tough, you know, and in the sort of this pre-bankruptcy era, this was a municipal problem. It was a community development finance problem. We didn't have self-help in Detroit. I mean, you needed the muscle to deliver on the potential of all of this good work going on in community and sort of ramping it up. So we spent a lot of time in the pre-bankruptcy investing in bringing CDFIs into Detroit, bolstering community-based entrepreneurial infrastructure, helping the mayor's office build up its capacity. And more than anything, the look forward, I think, is sort of a shorthand for where I hope Detroit will go, because we've got to pivot into the neighborhoods. A lot of this work on the left-hand side, the pre-bankruptcy, was just getting the basics right. How do you get a city hall that can solve problems? How do you get a CDFI community that can solve problems? How do you place external talent and mix it with long-time talent to create something more powerful? But now the question is really, how do we make sure that neighborhoods really begin developing the kind of problem-solving capacities that they need in order to be successful? And it's a classic sort of pivot to the neighborhoods. In many ways, the 2008 to 2013 period was stabilizing the core. It was making sure that downtown, the central corridor, had tax space, had a real estate market that began to make sense. And there, I think in the process, there began to be sort of an emerging concern on the part of neighborhood residents that the neighborhoods were just an afterthought, that this was all about corporations downtown and small businesses along the major corridor and building rail lines and all of this other stuff that we did. And so the next, please don't leave the room on this next drawing. This is think about this as sort of an impressionist painting. Forget about the details. I mean, this is actually the drawing for our Detroit team. This is their strategic plan, sort of. I mean, they're much smarter than that. But essentially, what we tried to depict, I tried to depict on this drawing, was the whole circle around of how community capacity evidences itself and how we might be supportive to it. So it's everything from making sure that people working in early childhood are better organized, how people working in the arts are better organized, how block clubs and community-based informal organizations, networks, have the supports they need. And then over on the left-hand side, in what is that, blue, are our more formal programs that are taking aim more at community development related capacity, community finance capacity, community project building capacity. And what is happening, I think, is the realization that these things are completely interconnected. That if you just piecemeal out this stuff and continue to piecemeal, you'll drive neighborhood folks crazy. And so the possibility of sort of working the other side up, working from neighborhoods up, saying in your neighborhood, are there ways in which arts capacity or community block club organizing capacity or early child capacity can sort of be held in a more sort of integrative, holistic way? And I think we're beginning to make progress. And this has, I think, been an important signature of Mayor Duggan, our current mayor. I think he believes this pivot to the neighborhoods will define his success. And I think this is our way of trying to be helpful. The third role that philanthropy played pre-bankruptcy was to do classic risk remediation, trying to figure out whether there were discrete transactions that the market simply wasn't prepared to enter. And in pre-bankruptcy Detroit, it was everywhere. There was just, the markets just had no interest in Detroit. It was just too hard. Residential markets, commercial markets, industrial markets, you name it. Small business lending, the whole deal. And so we went about trying to peel away the first level of risk for a number of sort of emblematic moves. So the first one was a Woodward Corridor Investment Fund. We had this long pipeline of projects along the major arterial of Detroit that runs all the way from the river all the way up to the city boundary at 8 Mile.
You might say a word about y'all's role in building that corridor.
Yeah. And okay, yeah, let me come back to that in just a moment, because this is sort of related to that. The Woodward Corridor Investment Fund was exactly what Joel suggested. It was that we had all of these pipeline projects that couldn't close. They had 13, 14 different sources of capital, and there was still gaps. And unless you began sort of stabilizing the corridor with projects that actually made sense and began signaling to the market that there was a market there and you actually could bridge the sort of the deep subsidy needs and sort of got a flywheel going, we were stuck. And we got a lot of criticism for this. Why are you, so focused on the center city and the businesses? But you needed to start somewhere. You needed to kind of get some traction and begin the market coming back. And so part of this was the investment in the rail line, Kresge to a whole story that will get me all sidetracked and Killy Walter. But it became clear that having a regional transit system was essential. I'll talk about that in just a second. But that the first leg of that had to be, again, starting somewhere, and it was to try to run a streetcar from the base of Detroit all the way up to the Midtown area, because it wasn't so much that would relieve traffic congestion along Woodward. There weren't very many cars on Woodward. because there weren't very many businesses and weren't very many residences, but that it would become the first step in a regional transit system. And as you all know, I don't need to tell you, it's an enormous land use play. I mean, the minute you have fixed rail in a system, look at any city in America. I mean, the investment has followed. And in the time since the rail has been introduced, we have had $13 billion of investment along that corridor. It's phenomenal. It raises all sorts of questions about displacement and gentrification and all that stuff that we can talk about, but it did what it was intended to do. And similarly, access to fresh food was a huge problem. There were no fresh food grocery stores in the entire city of Detroit. Or there were a couple of predatory ones that were just really dreadful. And so Whole Foods came to us and asked if we would be willing to subsidize one right in the center of the city because they couldn't pencil it out. We agreed to do that sort of through a green grocery fund with the idea that it wasn't just a subsidy to Whole Foods. It was again getting the flywheel going to demonstrate that you actually could make sure that fresh food at affordable prices, with Whole Foods not so affordable, but affordable prices to the residents of the city. And actually the great good news story out of this was that I got a call from Walter Robb, the co-founder of Whole Foods, 3 months after Whole Foods opened, and he said, in the first 3 months, we have surpassed our 2-year revenue projections. He said it is one of the most successful Whole Foods in the United States. They've then since moved it to the south side of Chicago, same model, and into New Orleans. So again, it's actually, and I said, well, that's great. So that means the loan we gave you, you'll pay us back? And he said, not exactly. Anyway, I'm sorry, that was more time than I intended. But the point was that taking a first layer of risk on transactional things to get things going struck us during this building era as a really important thing. What I suggested last time was that the pivot here would be to take that same sort of predisposition to try to de-risk transactions to neighborhoods, I mean to entire neighborhoods, to say markets don't work in neighborhoods either. And so whether it's an educational market or a commercial corridor market or a housing market or a open space market, there's just, these are all seen as too risky to invest in. So how would you do that? And what has happened over the last year is that we have really built out a strategy that applies in a neighborhood in Northwest Detroit. This is called the Livernois 6 Mile District. It's a very complicated part of town. It sits right next to some of the most affluent homes in the city of Detroit, but it is largely consists of a residential stock that really is right on the edge. It's not the kind of abandonment you see in all the photojournalistic essays of Detroit, but it's tipping. It's clearly going to go. The old Avenue of Fashion, which was the great African American shopping center to the north and to the west of this district, had been disinvested in over 20, 30, 40 years, on and on and on. So anyway, but there is stable housing stock, and what we basically said is, why don't we try to aggregate as many resources of as many different kinds as we can in this geography and see if we can't build out a neighborhood of opportunity. There are lots of assets in this community. People well organized in block clubs. There you have something called the University of Detroit Mercy on the east side of this area, Marygrove College on the west side, a new open space park in the middle, a program to stabilize neighborhood housing out of the mayor's office. That's the Fitzgerald, on and on and on. But the story I wanted to tell you quickly here is of Marygrove College, because I think it becomes emblematic of what it might mean to sort of take a risk that is sort of larger than just our Whole Foods or even a Woodward Corridor loan fund. I was approached about 2 years ago by the president of Marygrove College. And Marygrove College is a 100-year-old institution run by the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. They have run it for 100 years, and for 100 years it's been the cornerstone of this neighborhood. for all practical purposes, it's an HBCU. It's not formally an HBCU, but most of their students over the last 40 years have been African American women who either are going into nursing or into teaching. And she said, we've gone through a tough time. I'd love to get the foundation community together because we really need your help in bailing us out and giving us some bridge money to a new business plan. Our enrollment's gone down from 1,800 down to 600. We can't support, on and on. So we sat and she made a presentation that was focused mostly on trying to use their graduate courses, online graduate courses, to be an easy revenue generator. The point, though, is that we agreed to provide them some quick stabilization money to get them through the next couple months while we took a look at their books and just tried to understand what is it we were dealing with. Oh, God, it was just a nightmare. Oh my gosh, it's just a nightmare. The more we peeled, the more it became clear that this was completely unsustainable. There was no way in the world that this could work. They had a $8 million lien on the real estate by virtue of having made a really ill-considered, entered into a really ill-considered loan with one of the banks. They had a Federal Department of Education lien. They had the sisters themselves had pledged their pensions against some of these debts. Oh my God, it was horrible. And so we sort of were faced with a choice of, is this too horrible or not? And we concluded that it may have been too horrible, but this was too important. That having this kind of anchor in the community of deep symbolic importance to the community, faculty at Mary Grove live in the neighborhood, kids, have gone through this institution for years, and it sits in the heart of this larger effort to restabilize this critical neighborhood in Detroit. So a long story short, this is where having a social investments practice comes in handy. We grabbed the guy who used to do all of the complex transactions for JP Morgan Chase, who's on our staff, and he just began doing workouts. He got on the phone with Co-America Bank and started sort of hammering away, trying to see if we could get their loan down. We posted a letter of credit for the Department of Education so that they wouldn't freeze all of the scholarship money. We took out a loan. We took out a lien that the county had, and so all in, just to stabilize, we put in about $16 million in the course of less than a year. I mean, it was really fast because things were not working well.
Your staff did.
We did all of this. Yeah, we didn't. Again, this is part of maybe a larger conversation. The speed with which everyone needed to move was so fast, and the complexity of these relationships with banks and the federal government and county was so complex, we didn't feel that it would have been right to draw in our foundation colleagues. And frankly, they weren't equipped to help. I don't know what we would. Yeah, I don't know what we could have done to ask them to help. In a moment, I'll tell you why I think going forward that's different. But in the moment, it was just too much, too fast, too hard. And so anyway, we ended up working out all of these debts, taking on the debts ourselves, and then creating a conservancy, a nonprofit conservancy, to essentially hold the land and essentially remove the possibility that any of these lien holders or creditors of the institution could come and sweep in. This is about a 55-acre campus, and put a call center or something. And we had all sorts of proposals for what to do with it. I mean, people wanted to put another Whole Foods up there. They wanted to use it as a call center. They wanted to have it be a distribution center for someone or another. And what we felt very strongly is that for all of the reasons we felt it was important to stabilize, we felt it was important to sort of sketch a vision for the future that was consistent with the legacy of the institution. So we worked very closely with Mary Grove and with the sisters to say, what might that look like? And what we came up with was a construct that is essentially what we call P20, pre-K all the way through graduate school, and whether we might assemble those functions on campus. It became pretty quickly clear, that Mary Grove as an undergraduate institution couldn't survive. It just, the market was moving away from it. There was just, we couldn't do much about that, and that is obviously the plight of so many small liberal arts colleges. And so they closed, and we helped do all of the severance payments to the faculty. We made transition plans for every single student, so every single student was placed in another institution. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to be self-righteous about it, but it was just complicated. It was really hard, but it was really important. These were real faculty, real staff, real students who, you know, they didn't contribute to this, and so it was important. So if you took that out of the equation, the question was, how do you use this campus? And it's a beautiful campus. It looks just like, you know, Duke wannabe. I mean, it's beautiful old turn-of-the-century buildings and grounds that have been reasonably well maintained, a lot of deferred maintenance, as you might imagine. And so we began going to work on that. The first thing we knew we could do would be to take the early childhood work that we knew had to be done to creating a new center, sort of for those of you who know, sort of an edu-care kind of model, wraparound services, family engagement, community connection, and locate it here. Build a new one here. Very expensive, very complicated, but there's no reason in the world we couldn't do it. Make sure that Mary Grove's graduate program had enough breathing space to be successful. But then, what was in the middle of the, you know, the K through 12? And there we spent a lot of time, but I think the solution is potentially, for Detroit, earth-shattering, which is we were able to get the Detroit Public School Community District to partner with the University of Michigan, or vice versa, to create a K-12 school that will essentially be the locus of the University of Michigan's education teaching curriculum. They are going to move big chunks of their education school from Ann Arbor onto site. And essentially what they're going to do is create sort of a medical residency model in which their graduate students will have 3-year tenures and cycle through the same way a medical school graduate would. At the same time, they're teaching undergraduates how to be teachers, and presumably there will be a sort of a continuous flow throughout. The School of Education is led by this truly visionary Dean Moji. And I think this is sort of nothing short of a sort of a minor miracle, because then the Detroit Public Schools, because this was so compelling, and the University of Michigan really has no big presence in Detroit, it has lots of little presences in Detroit, and President Schlissel basically viewed this as his sort of, not his, I don't mean to personalize it, he didn't view it that way, but a huge legacy move on the part of the University of Michigan to contribute to the revitalization of the city of Detroit. And because that was such a compelling case, the Detroit Public Schools ended up sort of throwing out all of their normal regulations, principal selection, staff selection, the ability of local kids to attend the school. Normally this would have to be open to anybody in the city, which creates a creaming problem. You just get all the most talented kids across the city. This is going to be a neighborhood school. I mean, it really ought to be interested. We're going to start in the fall, a year from now, with K and 9, and then we'll move up. And so we should have it being fully functional within 3 or 4 years. Sorry to take quite so long on this, but it seems to me this is a huge risk. I mean, when you think about a loan to Whole Foods, it was important, actually. It sort of unleashed all of this other energy, but this is a big, big bet. Our board at first was very uncomfortable, I must tell you. I have an unbelievably sophisticated board. This was harder than the rail project, and this was harder than the bankruptcy. No question about it, because, you know, we're not school operators, and nor will we be, fortunately. But there was a lot of concern about whether we have the competence to pull something like this off, and at the very front end, it was not at all. I mean, no one dreamed that Michigan and the public schools would get together. I mean, would you have a charter? Would you have, you know, what would this be? And so to their enormous credit, as we began building this out, stabilizing the campus, turning it over to the Conservancy, I think their confidence grew that we actually could figure this out. And they've given us a commitment of up to $75 million to put into this over the next number of years. That
The Board of Education?
Oh, I'm sorry, the Kresge Board, excuse me.
Board.
Kresge Board, pardon me, it should have been clear. So that was a huge lift for them. Okay, and again, I'm sorry, I take quite so long. I can come back to any and all of this if you would like.
What's the role of the University of Detroit, Mercy?
That's a very interesting question. Detroit Mercy sits a mile to the east of Marygrove. And years ago, the nuns were very uncomfortable with the boys being over here and the girls being over here, and so there are no through streets. They won't let any streets run all the way through. It's very funny, actually, the symbolism. I love the symbolism. And one of the things we've done, you see that little green thing? It's this Civic Commons project. We've actually created a sort of a pathway through between the two schools. It's surrounded by housing and a new park and the like. But it would have made all the sense in the world, Joel, for a Jesuit institution to work with the sisters to figure out joint programming. And we spent a lot of time early on in this trying to make that happen. Couldn't make it happen. They just, because I think largely because Detroit Mercy is also having its problems, and this is all they, this is all they want is another headache to bail out a struggling school for women. So, and it's not just women, I should say. Marygrove, it was co-ed, but it was predominantly women. So anyway, so I'll keep flipping through fast, and we can come back. All right. So and then this one I can do more quickly, even though this is complete heartburn. The idea of serving as a guarantor of value is a fancy way to say, could we as a foundation invest in the kind of public infrastructure that would signal to the private sector that this was a place to invest? So the riverfront, Kresge put in the first $50 million of a $250 million Riverwalk reclamation over the course of 10 years. We did the same thing with the rail. We put the first $50 million on a $200 million project. And those are the kinds of things that permit Quicken Loans or Blue Cross Blue Shield or even GM to say this is a place where our employees want to be, where there can be vitality. And this was a hard one to convince the court of, because they said that these are such major plays. How do you sort of take this to the next phase? And there, the answer was what I talked about earlier, was the connection of the rail line to this larger regional system. And indeed, as part of the federal government's support for the streetcar line, they basically required that we create a regional transit authority with the ability to tax and govern a regional transit system. But it had to be done through the approval of all 4 counties involved and the city. We created a board with 2 representatives apiece from Wayne County, which is Detroit, Oakland County, which is a very affluent suburbs to the north, Macomb County, which is sort of more working class to the east, Washtenaw County, which picks up Ann Arbor, and the city of Detroit. And so we almost immediately after the bankruptcy began working on what a regional transit system would look like. We were approached a year ago again, I think this is all since I last saw you, by the Wayne County executive who said, I have met with my colleagues, and these are the chief executives of the entire county. I've met with my colleagues. There seems to be an appetite for a solution. Let's go for it. And I've skipped over that we actually did take a plan to the voters in 2016, and it was just smothered by the Trump wave in our northern suburbs. It ended up losing by 1/10 of a percentage point, but it was too much to overcome, I think, a sort of a conservative wave that sort of rocked southeast Michigan. So we thought, because that was close and because we're in sort of a new era, let's go back, let's find out what people's concerns were, let's do it better, and take it back. And so the Wayne County executive said to me, I think if we tweak this plan that almost passed, we can get it passed, and my colleagues think as well. Can you give us some support to go out and essentially do community meetings, figure out what the inputs would be, figure out how to rejigger the system to meet some of the concerns? And we did that. So we gave Wayne County $750,000, and they took on the nation's leading transit planners, and they developed a whole new plan, which is actually on the right here. And again, please don't worry about the details. It's too hard. That actually is the plan that we developed. It's a combination of bus rapid transit along major arterials. I'm sorry, it's one more, Joel. That one. And again, And basically, we felt that with this plan, we had, when they brought it back, each of the county executives' representatives, we had a working group of the executives' assistants, each of them signed off. And so we thought we were good to go. We thought, this is terrific. We've got the county executives who had been a little bit lukewarm the first time around on board to a plan that was quite different, much more flexible, anticipated next generation technology, scoped down sort of the fixed rail, fixed line issues. We thought we had covered the bases. And then woke up to a press conference shortly thereafter from the Oakland County Executive, L. Brooks Patterson. I'll just not say anything more. Really dreadful guy. Basically saying, no, we're not going to do this. And the Wayne County Executive, a guy named Warren Evans, a really fine county executive, said, what? I thought we had an agreement. We didn't have an agreement with me. We had an agreement with your chief of staff. Well, not with me. And then the Macomb guy who doesn't have independent thought in his, this is on tape, isn't it? Who is also problematic, sort of went along. And so all of a sudden, we were faced with a situation where we could not force through the Regional Rail Authority placing this on the ballot. And so this is a failure. I mean, we have not been able to deliver on that. I don't think ultimately it will be a failure. I think this plan, coupled with new leadership in the county, means that it will get deferred for a year or two or three. But it comes with all sorts of complexity. The authority of the Regional Transit Authority expires. We'll have to renew it. It costs money to keep the Regional Transit Authority going. We're the only source of support for that. So, but you know, I wish I could put on the board something that was sort of another one of these really feel-good results. This is not one of them, and this is just ridiculous that this region of 3 to 5 million people cannot figure out how to do public transit. It's a disgrace.
So what are the consequences of that
well,
temporary failure for the rest of the
one consequence is that you're not even competitive on the Amazon bid, and they told us that. They said, you know, there's actually a lot about Detroit that was very attractive. You've got the University of Michigan, you've got Michigan State, you've got this interesting talent base. It's sort of this dynamic, sort of Rust Belt chic. I mean, a lot of young people want to go there. You're on the border. You're right across the border from Windsor in Canada. It's the largest international trade cross. They actually said, you know, you guys were actually a lot closer than you think, but we can't go somewhere where there is not regional transit. We simply can't. And there were probably other reasons in Philadelphia or Austin, or, you know, ultimately will be too attractive. But that's a very tangible consequence, it seems to me. And even when you think about the ability to attract talent over the long term, what young person, or any person, but what young person wants to be in a region where you have to own a car to get anywhere? And we've actually seen that with the M1 line, that a lot of young people don't own cars. They live downtown, they queue line, it's called the queue line, they queue line down to their job centers. It just is common sense, and every other region in the country has figured this out except Detroit. So that's why we're going to keep at it, and we'll make it work.
But in terms of the other things that you've been talking about, to what degree does this really make it more difficult to achieve the other things that you've outlined that are working at this point, or seem to be?
I think the biggest consequence is the inability to fully connect inner city residents to suburban jobs. I mean, we have buses, but I don't know if you all may remember a couple of years ago, there was the walking man who was focused on, who was the focus of a number of scenarios. This is a guy who walked 13 hours a day to get to and from his job. He slept 3 hours a night, he had an 8-hour shift, and he walked 13 hours. It was crazy. It doesn't even seem possible, but it was again, symptomatic, emblematic of how hard it is to get from the Livernois 6-mile neighborhood up to a Best Buy or to a health system up in the burbs. You've got to do 2 or 3 transfers. The suburban system doesn't come into the city. The city can't go into the suburban system. The connections are goofy, which is why the red lines and the deep blue lines are so important. You've just got to create these connections. And so I think that is the single biggest consequence, is that we've got to figure out, you can't employ all Detroiters in the city of Detroit. No region works that way. We can do more, and we are doing more, but you've got to make sure that they're connecting, particularly in a region so dominated by these big auto and defense contractors, and they're all sprinkled in the northern burbs, and so you've got to figure out a way to do it. Plus, you can't, any of you who have been to Detroit lately, how was the train ride from downtown Detroit to the airport? There is none. It's crazy.
There is none.
There is none. You got to take a cab that costs $1 gazillion. I mean, it's nutty. So there are lots of sort of small tissue things that are hard, and then there are lots of things that are really big. And I think the big one is the connection of Detroit residents to jobs.
Yeah.
And vice versa. I mean, you know, we ought to just have a region that flows.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you want to finish up?
I have got to finish, yeah, don't I?
I mean, we've got about 15 minutes left.
Okay, I will just suggest what's in the other slides without going through them. So let me give you the 2-second version. Again, I'm happy to talk more if you'd like about it. The fifth piece was sort of acting as a seller. Pre-bankruptcy, we just felt it was really important to get talent, resources, attention into the city. Post-bankruptcy, it's to some extent trying to get Detroit to become part of a national conversation about the future of urban America. And so what have we learned? What have other places tell us? And we've actually launched a project that I think is quite interesting, in which we've been able to convince the Urban Institute, the Brookings Institute, Aspen, and Living Cities to join with us to go into communities across the country, ask them what they're working on that is hard, and whether national resources, technical resources, policy research, whatever it might be helpful to them. And we're right in the middle of that. Actually, this is not a bad slide if you wanted to read it. I think it's an interesting example of how we can increasingly serve as a platform for some of these national resources to land in place a little bit more effectively. And then the final one, I can do this really quickly, is that I think one of the sort of the most venerable of philanthropy's roles is just helping steward fragile ecologies of things that are simply not supported by the market, no matter how much we would like them to be. Arts, food systems, human service systems. This is a classic philanthropic role. We spent a lot of time building out the arts ecology pre-bankruptcy. I had projected that maybe the human development system and regional food systems might be the next generation. And this is, again, another complicated slide, but this is our human services strategy, which is increasingly focused on economic mobility. We're trying to both identify sort of emblematic human service organizations working in sort of multiple dimensions to help people advance into the economic mainstream and increase intergenerational mobility. And we're also trying to figure out how constellations of organizations working at the grassroots level can sort of work together to make sure that people have the supports they need to be viable. And we're going to try to land this in Detroit. We do this nationally. We'll try to land it in Detroit. So anyway, I'm sorry to take quite so long, but those are the sort of the 6 bodies of work. And I guess I just think, again, the takeaway is, I think, sometimes intentionality doesn't work, but often it does. I mean, if you're just really clear about where you want to head and what your capacities are, and each one of these has partners, I should say. Each one of these, we're working with the city, we're working with other foundations, we're working with the private sector. So you got to get comfortable with working across lines and particularly across sectoral lines. So I'll stop there. Sorry.
I have a certificate with which to present him. It says, Certificate of Appreciation presented to Rip Rapson, President and CEO of the Kresge Foundation, in recognition of your important contribution for the past 6 years to the Foundation Impact Research Group, presented on the 10th day of October in the year 2018, and signed by me. And
I need to say that this is Joel's very polite, diplomatic way of saying, I'm not inviting you back anymore.
No, it's not. I mean, we've got future certificates prepared. But the truth of the matter is, you can all see why I found it so interesting to have Rip come and keep us posted on what they're doing. It's a major urban experiment going on in the United States at this moment. I mean, starting from the bottom and trying to figure out how to make it work, and being kept posted every 2 or 3 years on what's going on struck me as being something that we would all benefit from, to see how it gets done. I mean, and it probably never ends,
yeah.
But the fact of the matter is there's progress along the way, and you can see it, you know, in what Rip described to you today. So we want you to keep coming back, and
that's very
as
nice.
long
Thank
as I'm
you.
here, you're going to continue to get invitations, and I hope you won't turn us down.
No,
so thank you very much. It's just absolutely fascinating.